Today we're building a simple swamp diorama for our massive tabletop game. We'll use Sculptamold, paint, E-Z Water, and terrain. And if you haven't seen the other builds or how this whole massive tabletop project started, there's a link below. Since we had some experience with making dioramas that were too small, like the mushroom patch and the original pond, we decided to expand the base of this one. We drew about a ½ inch outside of our paper guide piece. We used a utility knife to cut most of our pieces all at once, and then we broke them apart to make them easier to cut with a hot wire cutter. Now it was becoming second nature to us to head outside and melt some foam into pieces with a hot wire cutter. The swamp base was nice and big, which was good enough for playability, but still everything needed to fit on the table, and we were often struggling with balancing making things big enough to play on, but not so big as to completely fall off the table. This was a real challenge.
Once again, we used our plaster of Paris rocks that we had made 6 months ago using aluminum foil molds. We used these crinkled boulders in all the dioramas in the forest, and we used a couple of them on the swamp. We mass-produced all of them at the same time following the mushroom diorama as a reference, which you can see in a previous episode. Sculptamold was becoming a staple and we used it everywhere. Once the rocks were glued, we used the paste to cover the top of all the Forest World dioramas to make them more like dirt and hill-shaped. I'm working on the mushroom diorama here, but it was the same for all the bases. With the base completed, the next step was to make a tree stump hut for our central character to live in. He's rather big with his arms out, so I needed a plan. I did not really measure here. I drew around the figurine on a notepad piece of paper. After drawing the ground shape, I traced an arch to figure out the height of the stump and the size of the opening. I also cut that up with scissors and I was ready to go, freestyling it. I cut chunks of XPS foam to start building the base. I stacked them to create the rough shape of the structure following my paper plan. And I used the hot glue to assemble these pieces as I was going. I cut 2 large pieces to create the trunk of the tree. I glued them together and adjusted the size with the knife until the shape resembled what I had in mind. I unified everything using Sculptamold. This material was really key for this stump and to give it the look it has today. Once again, I mixed a few batches and I filled the gaps and smoothed out all the corners. I always start with a stick or a spatula, but then I always end up with both hands in it. I don't know, but using my fingers works much better than anything else. I used a few sticks to finish up the top of the stump. And I also used our metal brushes to texture the bark while the Sculptamold was still workable. And voila! Time to hand it off for the next step.
I worked on the swamp and the paint job. The base of the swamp was just some scrap XPS foam pieces laid out to make the perimeter and then covered in Sculptamold. I placed them around a plaster of Paris rock to give it some character. We joined the big stump hut to the base with hot glue and then used Sculptamold to hide the joints. That completed all these base pieces. I drilled a hole in the center of the swamp so that I could install LED lights later. In order to pour E-Z Water into the swamp, I'd need to prepare it with plaster of Paris, so I stuck a wooden dowel in the hole to avoid getting any plaster in it, and then coated the bottom of the pond with plaster of Paris. The dowel also allowed me to shape a peak out of the plaster to set the gem on top of. I prepared a gritty, textured coating to cover the base. I made it out of AK Interactive Earth Texture, Mod Podge, Aquarium Sand, and our Forest World staple brown paint from the dollar store. We were getting a lot better at making our own textures for the bases. I painted the top and sides of the base with the brown goop that we made. Is it pretty at first? Well, if you think of chocolate, then yes. But the theme for all the bases was muddy, reddish dirt, and it tied all the different dioramas together. So yes, the base layer of paint does look like a bathroom accident, but that's the fun of crafting. So don't worry, there's a lot more to be done on this one. I used a darker brown color for the bed of the pond, and then layered on some reds and greens and yellows, just to give it a more interesting color texture and really look like a dirty old swamp at the bottom. I guess that wasn't really helping with the bathroom thing. Once I was happy with that, I moved on to the stump, which got a darker brown base coat to make it look like an old hardwood tree. Then I moved on to the ground, and I add dabs of yellow and green and reds to unify the look of this base with the other dioramas in the forest world. I think that I may have even tossed in an orange color somewhere. Now, although I was trying to make everything fit together, I never did exactly the same thing twice, and that way I could learn a little more about painting and also follow my instincts to see what worked for me. I used a dry brush set from Golden Maple to white brush the bark of the stump and pick up some of the highlights. White brushing is one of my favorite techniques in painting. It makes all the details pop and adds a lot of realism. The white brushing worked particularly well on this piece because we'd used a metal brush to dig recesses that give the whole thing a bark texture.
The next step was to plant the central gem using our pre-wired LEDs in a battery. Our LEDs have a resistor capable to handle a 9-volt battery, otherwise it will explode. For the gem, we pulled out our big collection of plastic crystals that we got on Amazon.
The gem in the swamp was an important one because it was the final gem in the forest world before the portal opens, so we wanted it to be right. We tested them by using a wired LED connected to a battery pack. We tested out a few different colors we thought might look good, but in the end, a swamp needs a green gem. I set the gem in place and mixed up some plaster of Paris to cover the swamp bottom, which made me realize that painting it before plastering it was a massive waste of time. Oh well. I started by carefully plastering the edges of the wire hole and setting the gem in place to make sure that the hole did not get blocked with plaster. Once the plaster had dried and I'd repainted the swamp, I used deadfall branches to dress things up. Spent a lot of time selecting and placing these things meticulously. I'm not sure why I was so focused on this part, but I found it really cool. I set the Woodland Scenics branches in place with hot glue and plaster. I used the glue to position the branches and the plaster to blend them into the swamp bed and make it look like each branch is submerged in the mud. The plaster also helps to keep air bubbles from forming in the E-Z Water effect, and since E-Z Water pours on hot, the plaster would also protect the hot glue from melting. I gave the gem one last final test to make sure it was still functioning. Then I painted the plaster, making it the third time I painted the bottom of the swamp. These are the things you learn when you're a beginner. How to do things is obvious, but when to do things is a bit less clear when you're not sure exactly what your next step is. Although it really wasn't so bad to have done a few different paint jobs at various stages though. I made it certain that there were no missed spots, and either way, I gained experience. Well, now it was time to spruce things up with terrain flocking. I brushed on our old friend Mod Podge and sprinkled green flocking on with my fingers. I wanted the branches to look like they'd become overgrown with moss and algae, so I painted Mod Podge directly onto them and applied the flocking. To create a sense of uniformity to the environment, I also sprinkled on some flocking onto the top and sides of the stump. Then I tilted the whole thing over to remove the excess flocking from everything. I lay down a piece of parchment paper or wax paper whenever I do flocking, so I can pick up the leftovers and possibly use them again. Overall, this process went really smoothly. Compared to the pond, it was a dream. There was nothing left to do but attempt another E-Z Water pour, which would make or break the whole diorama. We pulled out the cast iron pot that we'd used for the first pour, and we used a heat gun to melt off the E-Z Water that was still stuck to the bottom and the sides. Now, we did this because that way we'd be able to put the pot back on the stove without poisoning ourselves. There was still a fair amount left on the bottom of the pot, so we melted it and then took the biggest chunk out. Because we really didn't like the amount of blue dye that was in the original pour, it had just blackened everything, so we wanted to start fresh. We got the pot back on the stove, and we added the last of the E-Z Water pellets that we had, and stirred them with a wooden skewer until they were liquefied. And at long last, the moment of truth had arrived. We poured our E-Z Water concoction into the swamp. When it was poured, it had a few bubbles, but I didn't think it was too bad for a swamp. I mean, it's a swamp. It has bubbles. I also didn't want to risk lighting the branches on fire with a heat gun, just to remove a few little bubbles, so I left them. All in all, the pour went pretty well. I probably could have taken a bit more time planning how I would pour to make sure that the entire shoreline was covered, but it still looks pretty good, and overall I'm pretty happy with it.
The last steps for this diorama were the static grass and foliage, which of course required our faithful grass applicator, power supply, and some static grass.
I didn't want too much grass on this one, so I focused on the shoreline, where I figured the most grass would grow naturally. I used 7mm light green grass as a base layer. I'm still a little traumatized dumping static grass all over my nice water area. I was really worried that I'd never be able to get it off again. I knocked off the excess and then added a little more on the other side of the swamp. Normally I would use spray tack glue in order to lock in the grass, but I didn't want to do that this time because I didn't want to spray glue all over the swamp water. So instead I used a dropper just to drizzle diluted glue into the grass. Woodland Scenics flower flocking had become a part of the process when I was making grass. I really love the way that it makes the field of grass look more wild and realistic. So I applied it with a spice shaker and I used all 4 of the colors that we had. I put down some globs of Mod Podge at various spots around the swamp and hand planted some 12mm straw grass. I decided to add a little more flocking to the place that I had painted a path from the swamp to the hut. I wanted it to be clear that someone lives here. And once again, we pulled out our seeds that look like leaves. These things are so cool. I swear, I love using them. I sprinkled them around the front edge of the diorama to help differentiate the path that goes from the swamp to the hut and the rest of the ground on the diorama. And I locked them in with diluted Mod Podge. I topped it all off with some more flower flocking. It just helps blend and tie everything together. But I still felt the swamp looked a little plain, and the tufts of straw were a bit too uniform. So I used Gamer's Grass garden flower tufts to break up the monotony. These are pretty easy to stick down. I just put a small amount of Mod Podge and then placed them where I thought they looked best. The back of the piece was looking a little bland and asymmetrical to the front, so I used some AK Interactive shrubberies to add another bush behind the stump. It was a little tough to get it to stay in place, but I worked at it eventually. It came out okay. And in the end, I was pretty happy with this build. So why don't we take a look at the final result? Thanks for watching. There's plenty of videos in this tabletop series, so feel free to check out some of the previous ones and be ready for the next one. Like and subscribe to support the channel.